Realm presents Born to the Blade, Episode 11.
Chapter 1. Takeshi. Bologna paced around the low table in the receiving room of the Ikarin embassy. She'd tried to cover the scratches on her face from several days ago with makeup, but he knew they were still there. Takeshi had been surprised that Bologna accepted his invitation, thinking she'd insist that he meet her at the Mertican embassy, as if she were the senior and he the junior. But something had changed for Bologna recently. Well, so much had changed. The assassination attempt on Ojo, the escalation of the war, and now... There's far too much here for us to just sweep away and ignore, Bologna. With Lavinia gone, it is up to the two of us and Michiko. Don't talk to me about Michiko. Bologna's face was red with anger. Her normally warm tones flushed into the colors of a raging fire. We will deal with this, you and I. Block Chris from bringing their witness to the council, work with the agents here to discredit their account. But we may need to ask the fleet to take a more direct hand with the Rimakan leadership. With them in protective custody, we can keep Chris from destroying their country with these horrible lies. Takeshi took a deep breath. He wanted little more than to return to his laboratory, his books, to retreat from the world, be left alone to his research. But Lavinia was gone. Kensuke, too. He was the senior-most Imperial warder. He'd sat through enough meetings with Bologna that he knew there was a delicate balance between letting her get her anger out and letting her roll over you like a cavalry charge. You had to pick your moment, pick your position. Takeshi stood and drew himself up as much as he could, casting aside his default slouch. Bologna stopped, her head cocked in confusion. The truth will get out, he said. If we face it head-on, we may be able to salvage a working relationship with Rumika. The Empress wants us to use this conflict to put Kulo on the defensive, force them back, and show them that they should not stand in our way. But we cannot hope to do that without cooperation from Rumika. You and I should sit down with Chris and talk through this. I think I can get them to hold off on a public hearing. Let them try. We'll overrule them, and if that doesn't work, I'll force a duel to dismiss their witness's testimony. Bologna had learned all of the wrong lessons from Lavinia, and seemingly none of the right ones. At a certain point, Takeshi said, you cannot bully everyone and expect to have any allies remaining. If Chris brings up the evidence, I will not vote to block their motion. Bologna stepped forward, her breath hot on his chin. How dare you defy me, defy the Empire? She was trying to be Lavinia, but she had neither the presence nor the skill to back up her threats the way Lavinia did, nor the authority. We've received no orders as to the evidence as of yet. Therefore, we have discretion in how to handle the situation. Talking may forge a way forward where threats and violence do not. I'm surrounded by cowards and fools, Bologna shouted, storming out of the room. Chapter 2. Michiko. The first lights of dawn cut across the horizon, not yet warming the chill wind rolling through the streets of the lowest island of Tuafe. Michiko drew her furs tighter as she sat on one of the only two wooden chairs at the noodle stand. They'd seen this place during their hunt for the Golden Lord. Ancestors. How that felt like a lifetime ago. She'd been so hopeful then, eager to please, ignorant of the brutal truth of what it meant to be part of the Mertican Empire. Chris was late. She could have guessed. They'd never been an early riser, often hiding yawns as they walked into council meetings. All around her were the familiar sights of the island. Laborers hurried to their posts, sailors staggered from their beds back to their ships. But unlike that day-long hunt, the streets were now filled with Rumican refugees. They slept in alleys under makeshift fur and muslin tents, filled boarding houses 5 or more to a room. If she did what she meant to do back home, before long, refugees from Kakute would be fighting for survival alongside these people. There was no war in history that didn't produce orphans, that didn't drive people from their homes. But if she did nothing, her people would be the ones at war, making orphans and burning fields. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But nothing about her life in Toifei had been easy or simple. If the Golden Lord weren't her ancestor, she might have been able to keep her life simple. Serve the Empire, devote herself to Lavinia's will, rise in the ranks slowly as a good weapon in the hands of the Empire. Now, she was her own weapon, wielded for her people and no others. Chris emerged from the crowd, and Michiko saw why it had taken them so long. Every step they took, a Rumikan refugee came to them asking for something. They passed out coins and gave the cloak from their back to a pole-thin parent who turned the cloak into a blanket for their child. Her heart went out to Chris, and to everyone around her. But she knew she could do more in Kakute than by staying here and suffering under Bologna's bullying. Chris disentangled himself from the last cluster of refugees and approached. "Sorry I'm late," they said to her. "2 breakfasts, please," they said to the proprietor, who was still deep in morning prep. "Tea is fine," she said. That got a nod. "Why did we need to meet down here?" "Anywhere I step on the ambassadorial level will be watched. It took me the better part of the night to lose my tail on the middle level, even with illusion sigils." "What's going on, Michiko?" She pulled a small weatherproof bag from her satchel and handed it to Chris. "This is everything I found out about what really happened to the trade fleet. Present it to the council, share it with your government, whatever you want. And you should leave a note for Anton at the autumn leave. He's hosting one of your country people, who you really should meet. She tells the most amazing stories." Chris looked confused. "You never know who is listening?" Chris nodded, and Michiko hoped she'd gotten her point across. She'd included her own note about Zan at the top of the folder, and Chris was clever enough to follow through. "Martika cannot be allowed to brush this under the table and keep pretending that their involvement is about anything more than opportunism." Chris's eyes went wide. "This is amazing. Thank you so much. When we present this, you'll present it. I'm leaving." The proprietor set 2 mugs next to them on the lip of the stall and poured still steaming tea, dark and rich, an ironic mix of Kuloi Redbush and Murtican Imperial Black. Michiko slid some coins across, which the proprietor pocketed with a nod. Payment for the tea and for his discretion. She took a sip, delighting in the taste, even as the too hot liquid burned her tongue. "Go?" Chris asked. "Why? How? You can stand up to Bologna. I'll back you. I can do more good at home than here. I should have seen it earlier. I knew it, but didn't believe. While Kakute remains in the Empire, I'll never have real autonomy on Toifei, even as senior warder. The Empress is preparing to send thousands of my people off to die so they can scare the Kuloi. But there are forces at home, the people who brought the Golden Lord here, and I can help them. For my people, for our ancestors, and for all the nations of the sky." Chris grinned, looking amazed. "What happened to the loyal Murtican subject I met on that ship not so long ago?" She grinned, the warmth of courage pushing away the chill of the morning. "Same thing that happened to the arrogant, careless blade crafter. We must become more than we were, more than we ever thought we could be. And that's why I have to go." "Will you come back?" "If I do," Michiko said, "it will be with an army or in chains." Chris took their mug in hand, looked down as if divining from the tea leaves, searching for a revelation. I wish you could stay. Murtika is helping us, but I don't trust them. This whole war never should have happened. It all fell apart so quickly. Now we have to pick up the pieces and do our part." Michiko wanted to stay, to protect their friends, to thrash Bologna and take over the Imperial delegation. She wanted to stand with her fellow warders against everything the Empress could throw against them. But that was suicide. The path she'd chosen meant leaving the friends she'd make, Chris and the others, but it would have to be worth it. Michiko downed her tea in one long gulp to screw up her courage. "Don't let this war turn friends into enemies. The more Rumika and Kulo fight, the more you and Adechike need to be friends." She stood, wrapped her arms around Chris's shoulders in a tight hug, then set off for the docks, her resolve holding by a thread. She could not look back, could not doubt herself. The only way out was forward. Chapter 3. Chris. Chris scanned the evidence over their tea. Without the account from the sailor that Michiko had turned up, the rest of the evidence was circumstantial. Reports of troop movements, ships unaccounted for, time-marked reports of when the trade ships had checked in. Chris stopped in with several groups of refugees before visiting the Autumn Leaf on their way back. A note from Anton was waiting for them.
Chris, my friend, I met one of your country people in my travels, and I think you two would get on very well. Please meet me at the corner of the Four Winds at your earliest convenience.
2 hours later, Chris and Anton escorted Zan to the Rumican embassy, hands on their swords the entire way.
Thank you, Anton, Chris said. Rumica is in your debt. I am in your debt. I'll hold you to that, friend. With some of that famed Rumican airstone, my ship would be the envy of the Seven Nations.
Chris gave a polite smile. Of course, but I can't promise anything right now.
That's perfectly fine. It's better to hold on to debts for a little while anyway. Far more fun to extract some free drinks out of someone's interest along the way.
Anton winked. Then Anton went on his way, leaving Chris to assemble the embassy staff. They called Alex and Nick, and together the three of them sorted through the evidence that Michiko had assembled and ran through Zan's account what felt like 100 times. Chris turned to the sailor.
If you go through with this, Martika will not soon forget it. I will protect you as best I can. I should be dead already. Food for the mist fiends. Let them come. I set sail for Rumica, and I'll see this through.
Chris beamed. Their hearts soared to be surrounded by their country people's bravery. Their refugee neighbors, robbed of everything except their lives, the scraps they could carry, still clung to hope, came together to support one another. This was Rumica's true strength. Kulo could not take that from them, nor the Empire.
I will make it so there is no room to question you, Chris said. We'll make Ojo see reason. We can send the refugees home. We can't get our hopes up, Alex said. Truth only matters in politics if you have the power to enforce it.
Chris looked to their sword.
I can enforce it. Will you fight every warder in the circle? A whole new gauntlet just to force a perfunctory admission. Nothing changes unless Kulo calls their fleet off and returns the island.
Zan's eyes were wide. They should probably send her to quarters with her guard, but if she was willing to risk her life, she should know the context. Chris could imagine what it would be like to be an unlikely witness as she'd become swept up in the winds of fate, and in Zan's position, Chris would want to know everything.
I don't care if it won't stop the war. We have to move forward. It might let me restart negotiations with Ojo, lead Vania to back off so we have time to reach a ceasefire.
Chris knew they were grasping, but when you were falling to your death, you grabbed hold of whatever you could get.
I'll make the summons, Nick said, standing. We should keep working on this, Alex said. I'll have some locals follow up on the leads, try to corroborate some accounts.
And for you, Chris said to Zan, our chef makes the most amazing tarts. No good facing danger on an empty stomach. An hour later, Chris stood alone in the public council chambers. They looked at the clock and despaired. The others should have arrived half an hour ago. They'd sent runners via Yokno to remind the warders of the meeting, but there was no response. Zan stood next to them, stepping side to side with nervousness. Without a quorum of warders, Chris could not enter anything into the record. Zan's testimony did not exist for the circle if it wasn't in the record. I called using the proper channels. I used the system. But they would not come. Not even Takeshi. They waited another half hour, fuming as they looked the documents over again and again. The words burned into their mind like an undying sigil. But no one came. Chapter 4. Ojo. Ojo hung his head in shame as Adechike cut distant friends. Ojo could barely stand, and he definitely couldn't craft. The faces of Guildmasters Nenge, Isabri, Amawesi, and Adokwe appeared. Ojo hadn't seen a face from back home other than these four since their High Skies faction had seized power.
So good of you to answer our summons, Warder, Nenge said. I was unavoidably detained, Ojo said, wearing his best diplomatic smile.
He stood, his left arm leaning on the strong oak chair at his desk, the right wrapped tightly in a sling. The doctor said that his right hand would never again be able to hold a blade. He'd waved them off, refused to believe it. He'd rehabilitated injuries before. It was denial, but he had other things to worry about. The medication helped, but left him in a fog, like he had to fight a battle of wills just to be able to read and write, to speak in complete sentences. "You heard the report I gave," Adechike said. "He was attacked. It's a miracle he's alive." "Hold steady," Ojo whispered. "Let them be." Sweat soaked his robes and the massive bandages around his arm. His mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton, but he struggled through, over-enunciating. "I understand that Adechike has provided reports during my absence. What news from the front?" Guildmaster Nenge spoke through a scowl, her hair perfectly coiffed, her robes immaculate. "The Mertican fleet has captured 2 supply ships and sent 2 cruisers limping home." She glanced down at a report. "We've lost 80 Marines, over 200 sailors, and 3 blade crafters in skirmishes so far. Without relief from Livanians, our line would have collapsed a week ago. The dreadnought has been boxed in by a dozen ships, and we found no other gaps in their line, even with assistance from the Vanian fleet." Guildmaster Adokwe's nostrils flared. "Mertika was ready for this, and they're making us pay for every league of space we take." Isabri said, "But take it we will. We've already begun strip mining the Rumakan Island to forge the plates for a new wave of ships. The High Skies, a new battleship, will be ready to set sail in a week. Once it is complete, we will commit the reserves to back up the dreadnought. That fleet will break the Mertican line and seize another island from Rumika, while ground troops search for the elusive scientists so that we may gain this Rumikan method." Ojo gripped the chair tighter, holding back rage. "That airstone must be used to shore up the island. We cannot hope to save our people if we use it for war." "Kulo does not have time for half measures and stalling tactics. We use some airstone now, and we will have the Rumikan method all the sooner. Then the rest of what we gain from Rumika's outlying islands will let us stabilize Kulo and support our campaign against Mertika." Ojo started to speak, but Isabri cut him off immediately. "That's enough. We've been patient with you, Ojo." They hadn't. "We've tried to hold your hand and give respect to the work you've put in, misguided though it may be." "If what they've given is respect, I'd hate to see the alternative." "But we can no longer pretend that there isn't a problem." For a heartbeat, Ojo dreamed that this meant the High Skies faction was stepping back. But he knew it wasn't. Dread filled his mind like a cruiser blocking out the sun during a bombing run. "Given your condition," Nenge said, disgust smeared across her face, "it is clear that you are not able to serve. Kulo needs strong representation on Tuafe, and more important, we cannot be yoked to the compromising conciliatory traditions that for too long have guided our foreign policy. Your services are no longer needed, Warder Kante. Junior Warder Akutu shall adopt your role effective immediately. You are to return home on the next ship for reassignment." He saw them coming as sure as the most telegraphed lunge, but he had no defenses, no contingency plan, no power. The light went out of the room, and he fell into the chair in a heap, all sense of balance and direction lost. Adechike spoke, doubtless some words in his defense, but his voice was far away, as if across a noisy battlefield instead of right beside him, still holding him with one strong arm. "I can't do it," Adechike said, his breath in Ojo's ear. Ojo grabbed hold of the younger man like a lifeline. "You must. If you refuse, they'll send a puppet. They may still." Focusing, Ojo wiped the tears from his eyes. He concentrated on the pool, his vision resolving again to show the unwelcome quartet that had cut his world out from under him. "Thank you for the trust you're placing in me, Guildmasters," Adechike said, no trace of anger in his voice. Ojo thought himself flexible, savvy, but Adechike's spirit was like the raging Ahra River.
You could drop a boulder the size of a house in the middle, but the river would keep flowing. Guildmaster Amewise said, "We will have more orders for you shortly, Warder Akutu. The winds are shifting, and if you serve well, your fortunes and those of your family will soar high during Kulo's ascendance." "For Kulo," Adechike said. "For Kulo," the four answered. Adechike dropped the sigil and the pool went still. The young man sighed, setting the blade down on the desk. Ojo let loose a bellow of pain and loss and rage. He did not care if the other warders heard him. He'd given his life to Kulo, turned every fiber of his being to the service of his people. He'd carved hope out of the hard rock of inevitability. And yet they tossed him away like the skin of an orange. Anger made his movements shaky, worse even than the clumsiness he felt due to the medications the doctors had given him to dull the pain. His arm would heal, or it would not. The high skies had taken something more essential, more irreplaceable from him than his body. They had stolen his purpose, his guiding star. If he was not a warder, what was he? Penelope was gone. Most of his friends back home hadn't seen him in a decade. The embassy was his world. And now they wanted him to return to Kulo. And for what? To push papers in some back office counting mail? Arbitrate arguments between farmers? Adechike knelt to face Ojo eye to eye, his hand on his mentor's unwounded forearm. "Ojo, I didn't know. I'll fight this. Maybe if it's just me, I can convince them to let you stay until you've healed. Make this change temporary." Ojo squeezed the young man's arm. "You are too kind, too joyful for the times we live in. You must guard that fire in your heart against the chill winds of war. They would turn you into a weapon against the others. You must remember what it means to be Kuloi, what we stand for. If we lose our soul to save our people, do we deserve to survive?" "I will do my best," Adechike said. His eyes were red with tears. He felt everything so deeply. Was I ever so young? Ojo wondered. You will need to learn to hide your feelings better, too. To the miss with that, he said. What now? Now you tell Yokno what has happened. I am going to write some letters, and then I am going down island to drink until I cannot think. Chapter 5. Chris. With Zan safely squared away in the Rumican embassy behind heavy doors and protected by a half-dozen guards, Chris went on the offensive. Evidence in hand, backed up with a sigil of duplication, Chris marched across the ambassadorial grounds to the Kuloi embassy. They followed the proper procedures, announcing themselves and their official request from warder to warder, waiting when they should wait, and every other bit of propriety that could be used against them. And they waited. And waited. But only the page answered. I'm sorry, Warder Den, but the warder is not available. What about his junior, Adechike Akutu? Again, I'm sorry, the warder's not available. It had to start with Kulo. If Kulo agreed with the evidence, it could end the war. Everything else was just to gather more support. So they waited some more. In the council chambers, they'd have Zan to give her testimony live, but even on paper, the picture was clear. They just needed to get the others to see it. An hour later, the page returned and brought Chris into the receiving room, where Adechike stood over a desk filled with papers. Adechike grinned as Chris entered. Good day. Good day. Is Warder Conte available, or is he recovering? I'd like to speak to both of you, if possible. It's very important. Every inch of Chris just wanted to spill the bag out and start talking through the evidence, but that wouldn't do. They would follow every damned protocol, leave no room for doubt or dismissal. A shadow passed over Adechike's face. Sorry, he's not. I am serving in his stead. Of course, I hope he's recovering well, Chris said, sticking to the niceties as long as they could. Adechike nodded. I found it, Chris blurted out. The evidence that will end the war between our people. It was Murtika all along. I'm sorry I ever doubted you, doubted Ojo, but we will have justice. Chris walked Adechike through the evidence, shared every piece, every account, every scrap from every ledger. And when it was done, they said, "What do you say, friend? Shall we go into war?" Adechike looked to the papers, then looked to Chris. But his look was not one of hope or relief, it was guilt. "And the sailor, she is safe? She will testify under a sigil of truth?" "Of course," Chris said. Adechike paced around the desk, his breathing intentionally slow. From the time Chris spent with Adechike training, talking, and drinking, none of these were good signs. "I can't act without Kulot's approval. I can present this evidence, but the decision is not mine," he said finally. "How can they do anything but end the war? We were deceived. We can claim reparations from Mertika and start over. I'll make the Rumican elders see reason. It will be like the war never happened, but it did. And it may keep happening. I'll let you know as soon as I have a response." The wind went out of Chris's sails. It was supposed to be the three of them together, Chris, Ojo, and Adechike, the warders of Rumika and Kulot standing together once more to fix the terrible wrong that had pitted them against each other. But there were other warders, and the further Zan's account spread, the harder it would be for Mertika to maintain their lie. "Of course, just let me know." "Thank you, Chris. I hope you're right, that we'll be able to stop the war. I would like nothing more in the world than to go back to the way things were." Next, they visited Takeshi, hoping to go from friend to friend, that Takeshi could convince Bologna to come to the table, especially with Michiko gone and the Kakute seat empty. Takeshi met them immediately. His laboratory equipment was set off to one side, his desk half a mess of papers, half an immaculate and organized workstation. His chair was pulled to the clean side, but Takeshi was already standing when Chris entered. Chris launched right in. "Thank you for seeing me. I called a meeting today, but no one came. I'm very sorry I could not attend. Bologna has picked up where Lavinia left off in terms of dominating the agenda. What I have to say must be heard by every warder still on Toifé, and witnesses. The sooner the better. I have evidence." "I know," Takeshi said. Michiko confronted Bologna with what she'd found, but she could not make her see reason. Nor could I. Bologna will do what she can to prevent this from coming to light, and my hands are tied. The Empire sidelined Kensuke for Michiko, and with her gone, if I'm removed, Bologna will soon have two good puppets and the lockstep unity the Empress demands." "So what does that mean in practice? With Taro gone, I need Kulot, Vanya, and then at least one Imperial warder to appear for the circle to have a quorum." Takeshi gave a mischievous grin, his face lively, where so often it was reserved, watching the world, studying it, but not in it. "I am sparring with Bologna in the gardens this afternoon at 3. It is, after all, not required that council meetings be conducted in only those 2 rooms. "You're brilliant." Chris grabbed Takeshi in a joyful hug without thinking. But once they were there, they smelled the spiced soaps Takeshi used, the scent of sandalwood and the warmth of his chest. Chris dropped the hug as quickly as they'd begun it. Now it was their turn to hold back. No time for that, not when things were so perilous. Takeshi's cheeks flushed, probably as much from surprise as anything. But hopefully not only from surprise, Chris thought. Back home, those half-glances and longing looks, those terrifying, delightful silences were fine. But the stakes were too high for such dangerous unknowns. Not yet, at least. Takeshi had opened the door for the meeting. That was enough. It'd have to be enough. They just had to convince Cassia. "Thank you. I'll see you this afternoon." Chris left a note with Adechike detailing the special meeting location. Cassia accepted their invitation with a raised eyebrow, but stayed very formal throughout. Not surprising, given Vanya's declaration for Kulot and the war, but she did seem curious to hear Zan's account in person, which was promising. Out of formality, and to give Michiko as much cover as possible, they left a message with the Kakute embassy. Every hour of lead Michiko got on Mertika was another pace she could steal into their measure without response. Chris also left a letter for Warder He at the Tsukisen embassy. The letter argued that in a time of such crisis, Tsukisen could be a stabilizing influence. But Tsuki-sen had weathered greater political storms than this by withdrawing, their nation the farthest from Murtika and on the other side of the maelstrom from Kulo. It'd be dangerous to forget them entirely, but for the moment, Chris had no illusions that Warder He would come sailing in at the fore of a fleet of peacemaker ships to push the Murtikans and Kuloi apart. Even with reports to read and letters to write, they could not help but feel the minutes stretch on into eternity. They went to the chamber to think, then walked out with Yokno to the gardens that bordered the Murtikan grounds. Adetsuke arrived first, but without Ojo. Kasia came next. Takeshi walked in several minutes later, making a show of looking surprised by the meeting. 4 was all they needed. They nodded to Yokno, who called the circle into session. Yokno had not been pleased by Chris's request, but as they argued, if the warders would not meet a summons to the circle, then to preserve the sanctity of the circle they needed to adapt.
"Greetings, warders," Yokno called in a loud voice, his words echoing. "Warder Den has called a session, so they take the floor."
Chris stepped forward. "Thank you for joining me, warders. I know it's been a very hard few weeks and months for us, which is why it is even more important that the information—" A shout rang out on the other side of a hedge. "Stop!" The light of a sigil flashed through the brush, then the shrub folded onto the ground, revealing a furious Bellona, sword in hand. "Greetings, Warder Avitas," Chris said. "Thank you for joining us." "Silence!" she called.
"Warder Den has the floor,"
Yokno said, his face blank, in the same tone he used when Chris was trying to barrel through something. The guarded neutrality Chris had come to appreciate more every week as the intricacies of the circle became clearer. "I know what they're going to say, and it's all nonsense. Give that trash to me so I can toss it into my fireplace where it belongs."
"Is it trash or is it kindling, Warder Avitas?"
Adetsuke asked. Kasia chuckled.
"Warder Den is speaking. A procedure declares we must hear them out,"
Takeshi added. "Rumika calls upon the sailor Zan, the only known survivor of the lost trade fleet." From around the corner, Nick and Chris escorted Zan into the group. Zan's hands gripped each other, and she looked terrified. She walked up to Chris, who caught her gaze. "It's okay. Just tell us who you are and what you saw. You're safe here." As if to specifically make Chris into a liar, Bellona stepped forward and raised her blade. "No, we do not know this Zan. Of course a Rumikan would say whatever Chris wants them to." "Her," Chris said. "Zan has agreed to speak within a circle of banished lies. You can draw the sigil yourself if you want to." That was risky. If Bellona were skilled enough, she could manipulate the sigil to make it provide a false positive. But there was no way she could do so without the others noticing. "Spare me your grandstanding. This libel must not be allowed to enter the record. Murtika has Rumika's best interests in mind, even if they're too stupid to be grateful." Chris's hand went to their blade. "Do you challenge her right to speak, despite my invitation?" "I so challenge." Good, Chris thought. They could use a fight to blow off some steam. Bellona all but slammed her ceremonial sword onto the altar of challenge. Chris answered as calmly as they could, though their ears were already growing hot with anticipation. The two made their preparations on the field. The crowd was small, but all that mattered was Yokno and the other warders. Chris stretched diligently, keeping the fire in their heart contained. In the gauntlet, they'd gotten ahead of themselves, played too loose. They could not afford to lose here. They might hope that others would stand up for them like Ojo and he had done on their first day in Tuafe, but they couldn't count on anything other than this one chance. Without Zan's testimony, all they had was circumstantial evidence and supposition. Bellona had trained with Lavinia for most of a year, but she lacked experience. Lavinia fought so many of Murtika's duels that Chris had only seen Bellona duel for minor matters. Chris didn't know her style, but they were well practiced, and they had the right on their side. Chris knelt for a moment and prayed, casting their thoughts back to their homeland, to the mountains and lakes, to the bustling streets and the orderly laboratories. They thought of every single person they'd met in their training tour. "Gods, guide my hand. Let me be the vessel of my people's thirst for justice." Yokno stepped forward, and Chris and Bellona shook. They agreed on a duel of bladecraft, fought to first blood, then returned to their sides. Chris looked to Takeshi, to Adetsuke, and to Kasia. These colleagues, who were sometimes friends, sometimes rivals, and who were all caught up in the same storm of change and uncertainty that had descended upon Toifei shortly after the gauntlet. Chris fought for Rumika, but they also fought for the circle, for its validity. And if they lost, Chris worried that the circle might not survive. Yokno's bell rang and the duel began. They both opened with sigils of speed and agility, and Bologna then moved to offensive sigils, which Chris blocked or countered as they closed. Bologna's bladecraft was technically solid, but uninspired. Chris could read every sigil as soon as it started, if not predict them ahead of time. Marksman's arrow, thunderclap, mud pit. Chris countered them one by one, advancing all the while. Don't get cocky, they told themselves as they beat Bologna's blade aside, moving the fight into measure. As Chris pressed her, Bologna showed her skill. She never yielded the center line to Chris, even as their footwork pushed Bologna left, right, and back. She always returned to center. Skilled, but, again, predictable. Anytime you knew where your opponent was going to move, you could exploit it. Just as Chris was going to lay a trap, Bologna pressed. Chris grinned. Come on, then. Try me, they thought. The Mertican cut high, disengaging into a low thrust when Chris moved to parry. Chris adjusted their block to push Bologna's thrust aside, barely. The thrust pierced their jerkin. But that created an opening. While Bologna's blade was halfway through their clothes, Chris passed their sword into their other hand and used the now free hand to wrap around Bologna's sword arm. Now it was wrestling, and when Adechike and Chris weren't glowering at each other during bad times, they'd continued sparring, which meant that Chris had picked up more than a few tricks. And, perhaps more important, gotten comfortable with grappling. They sank into a stabler stance while Bologna flailed, punching with her offhand and trying to break free. Chris blocked the blows with the hilt and pommel of their sword, and Bologna gave up on that strategy quickly. In a duel to the death, Chris would run Bologna through or slit her neck. It would be so easy. Chris thought of the dozens of Rumikins and Kuloi who had died when the trade ships had gone down. The hundreds who had died since the pointless war had begun. But killing Bologna wouldn't bring them back. So, instead, Chris aimed a shallow cut across the Mertican's calf, then pushed her away, resetting to center in case she tried to lash out in reprisal. The bell rang twice, even as Chris continued to back off, still in guard. Bologna took one angry step toward Chris, blade raised, then stopped. If she were Lavinia, she might press it, but for good and for ill, Bologna was not Lavinia. The Mertican woman lowered her blade and nodded to Chris. So be it. Share your lies, and we'll deal with them as they come. The trap sprung. Yokno reconvened the council in the private chambers. Chris cut the sigil's circle of banished lies, moving slowly and precisely to show all present that their sigil contained no secret modifications, no tricks. The sigil flared and whirled into a 6-foot-wide circle on the ground. Zan stepped into the circle and spoke. She told them the story as she'd told it to Chris, practiced but not rehearsed. She spoke with her eyes closed, brows scrunched up as if forcing her mind to hold on to every detail. We had just entered the Engwahin rocks, and 3 Mertican ships came out from behind a crag. We didn't think it would be too much of a problem. We were 6, and with guards and extra blade crafters. As she spoke, Chris distributed copies of the supporting evidence and the written version of Zan's testimony. Zan paused, looking awestruck. Then they focused their magic in some way I had never seen. You'd know better, being blade crafters, but the ships just splintered apart, all of them. I passed out and woke up lashed to a chunk of the hull that had enough charge in its airstone to stay aloft until Anton found me. How can you be certain they were Merticans? Bologna said. They were flying Mertican colors, Zan answered, and every one of them had the crowned Empress figurehead. This is all still circumstantial, Bologna said. Anyone could have flown Mertican flags to frame my people for this. The expected counter. Chris had an answer, but they didn't even have to respond. Adechike asked, How many Mertican flags have you seen on ships in your days, Sailor Zan? Adechike asked. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Mostly in port, but sometimes passing in the distance. Nothing like that purple in all the sky, I tell you what. It is very distinctive, I agree. Warder Avitas, can you remind us of why the Mertican colors are so distinct? Chris knew, and so did most of the others in all likelihood.
But forcing her to say it and to get it on the record was essential. Bologna's cheeks grew more red by the moment. "Everyone knows that," she snapped. "The berries used to make the dye grow only in the highlands of Mertika. But that's no secret. Anyone could procure the berries." Chris jumped in to keep control of the line of questioning. "What price do those berries fetch on the open market? Dechike, I imagine you'd know, given Kulot's reputation for trade." Dechike shrugged at the simple question. 100 talons a bushel, 10 times the price of any other berry its size. Maybe 10 bushels go on the market in any given year, and every one of them is tracked by Mertican Trade Authority and verified here. Your embassy holds those records, Bologna. You'd know better than any of us." Chris picked up where Dechike left off, speaking to the room. "And if you're saying that there are truly 3 or more non-Mertican ships flying your colors and fitted with the intricately carved crowned empress prow, and that they have not been caught and brought to justice for falsifying your colors, how can any of us ever trust those colors again? A Mertican warship flying over Rumika claiming to protect us from Kulot might be a raider looking to pillage our countryside. I'm very worried about the implications of this claim you're making," Chris said, trying to sound as sincere as they could manage. The nods from Cassia and Takeshi told Chris they'd made their point, even as Bologna made a sound not unlike a teapot about to boil over. Cassia spoke up, ignoring Bologna's fuming. "I am also very concerned about Sailor Zen's description of the bladecraft effect being used. It doesn't match any techniques I'm familiar with." "Nor I," Chris said. "Takeshi, you've spent a lot of time studying the history of bladecraft, so maybe you'd know better. The only things I've heard of that come close to this description are the accounts of massed bladecraft used 200 years ago in the war between Kulot and Zenatai. Would you agree?" "We're working with limited information, so I can't be certain, but it's the most likely case." Chris prepared their finishing move. "So, in one testimony, sanctified by a circle of banished lies, we hear that the Rumican Kulot trade fleet was either attacked by Merticans or by pirates with stolen Mertican colors and Mertican figurehead prows, and that those attackers, Mertican or pirate, likely used massed bladecraft and were able to destroy 6 ships nearly all at once." Chris continued. "I don't know about you all, but I'm frankly terrified. It's not just about what happened to Rumika, not just the fact that the war between my people and Kulot's happened for no good reason, but the idea that some fleet out there may be resurrecting the practice of massed bladecraft, all while the nations are pulling apart and sending their senior bladecrafters to the war front. Not only do we need to see justice done for the true attackers against the trade fleet, we need to keep our nations from repeating the errors of our ancestors." The room was silent for a moment. Chris felt hollowed out. They'd prepared and rehearsed, tried to anticipate every possible counter-argument, and the speech they'd given was maybe their best ever. The testimony was given. Doubts about the flags dimmed, if not totally banished. Bologna could dispute the connection between Mertican flags and a ship being under Mertican command, but for there to be a half-dozen ships, all with forged or stolen colors, was as much a stain on Mertika's reputation as it was an alibi. With no one speaking up, Chris went on. "My fellow warders, we have the chance to end the war before more lives are lost. Warders are known as duelists, but if we succeed here, we could become famous not as warriors but as peacemakers. Then we can go back to squabbling about trade agreements and hunting rights." "Of course, you know we'll have to corroborate these claims with our own investigations," Cassia said. "Of course, I just ask that you do that. If my interpretation of Sailor Zan's account is accurate, what does that mean for the war? For our nation's paths forward?" "That's all nonsense," Bologna said, incapable of letting this go without taking one more shot. "Nonsense conjured up because Rumika is unwilling to fully accept the wisdom of fighting the war under Mertican leadership." That's it, Chris thought. And arguing about it is a fabulous way to endear yourself to your ally. In a world where the Merticans weren't responsible for the convoy's destruction, they'd have to put more effort into working alongside Bologna and Mertika to wage the war. But the idea of relying on the rapacious empire set Chris's hair on end. When Mertika had taken Kakute, they'd claimed that they were on a peacekeeping mission and responding to factions within the nation that cried out to become part of the empire. What was happening now was more than enough of an excuse to wrap the tendrils of the empire around Rumika and begin to squeeze. Their business done, Chris yielded the floor and Yokno closed the meeting. Chris had planted the seed. Whether it would bloom into action was up to their colleagues. Chapter 6. Dechike.
Kulot's private meeting chambers in the tower still felt like Ojo's space. Adechike supposed that he'd have to put his own touch on the room, transfer some of the furniture and art from the embassy, if not for his comfort, then to make the proper show of confidence and authority. He knew that Ojo should still be the warder, even if no one else did. But for Kulot's sake, Adechike knew he had to hold on to the position for as long as he could, appease the high skies where necessary and blunt their aggression whenever possible. But that's what Ojo tried to do, said a doubting voice in his mind. And without the assassination attempt, he would have continued to do so. As long as Adechike walked the tightrope flawlessly, he would not fall. There was a knock at the door. "Enter," he said. Cassia stepped into the office, carrying her copy of the evidence. "We should talk about this," she said. "Of course. Shall we take tea?" She nodded. Adechike rang the bell to call for their steward. "Greetings, Warder Petros," the steward said as he stepped into the room. "Hello." "Can you prepare a pot of the amber brush?" Adechike asked, "and whatever scones are still around." "I'm not hungry," Cassia said. "I am, unfortunately. Bad habit. I'll need a long training session once we're done with these papers. I've been doing too much sitting and pacing and worrying and not enough sparring." The steward nodded and disappeared to work magic with the ambassadorial staff. Then they set to talking. "If this bears out, Michiko will have to face consequences. But extracting concessions from them while we're at war and they're ostensibly allies of Rumika? This will be very messy. And the idea of mass bladecraft returning has me very worried." "If it were one problem or the other, it would make sense," Cassia said. "Everything is pulling at cross purposes. The Trine will demand utter clarity before they give their decision. I'll make sure Penelope sees all of this. Maybe she can provide some guidance, especially on the bladecraft effect." She paused. "How is Ojo?" Adechike paused a moment, trying to decide how to answer. She was his ally, his peer. Keeping news from her would cut away at the already tenuous trust between them. "The truth, then." "Did you hear?" Cassia nodded. Even as allies, they had eyes on each other. "He left to attend to some personal matters," Adechike said. Cassia raised an eyebrow. "If I were him, I'd be getting drunk right now." The diplomatic answer was easily at hand, but there wasn't much reason to dissemble with Cassia. "I think that's exactly what he's doing, which is a terrible idea given his condition and the medications, but Shun will look after him." Cassia nodded knowingly. "What about Kulot? What will your leadership say about all of this?" Adechike shrugged, but left off his usual smile. "Anything that can weaken Michiko is useful for the war effort, but some things, once begun, cannot easily be halted." "Vanya's support is not one of those things. If this information proves accurate, then Kulot's excuse for war disappears like a broken sigil." "I know. What I can say is that Ojo's dismissal was not because of his injury. There's only so much I can do without upsetting the guildmasters." Cassia nodded. "Of course, the Trine has the courtesy to be open and vocal about their infighting and gives us leave to do the same. But they're not breathing down my back the way the guildmasters were Ojo's." The tea arrived, and they set back to work, discussing the evidence and the account of the bladecraft, arguing possibilities, relative levels of competence in each possibility, and so on. Sometimes being a warder was about daring duels and expert swordplay. Sometimes it was veiled statements and secret meetings. And sometimes it was detective work. Chapter 7. Ojo. Ojo didn't have to be the warder for Shun to give him a private room to drown his sorrows. 2 empty bottles stood to his side on the table, the last cup of amber liquid wafting its smoky fragrance to his nose. To the other side was a small mound of crumpled-up parchment, cast-off drafts of the letter he tried to write, even as his hand shook. The coals of the table's inset barbecue still burned, fed where they should have been left to die. "My dearest Penelope." Oh, too familiar. "Dear Battle Mistress Kirkos." Too formal. He wanted little more than for her to be there, to be able to speak his mind in person. Not as warders, not as whatever they'd become when she left. As a man and a woman. It was never supposed to get this complicated. Not with Rumika, not with Penelope. He'd cultivated a life where things made sense, and almost before he could realize, everything started slipping through his fingers. He looked to his bandaged right arm. "You'll probably never be able to lift a blade with your right hand again," the doctor had said. His mind raced through a lifetime of memories. Duels won and lost, endless letters penned with a practiced hand, countless hours training to perfect the two-blade style. Warder Ache's voice guiding him through forms, tossing his niece high into the air with both hands. He set the quill down and finished the cup. "More," he called louder than he'd meant to. Ojo pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and thought for a full minute before beginning. The liquor clouded his thoughts, but failed to eliminate the pain in his arm. This time, he made it past the address, past the pleasantries, and into a several-paragraph rambling confession of his feelings, his shame over losing his post. He found himself pleading for her to return and bring stability to the warder's circle. He wiped the tears from his eyes, blinked, tried to clear his focus, and looked again. Nothing would hold still, nothing made sense. Everything was ash and leather in his mouth and his heart. If Penelope would just come back. "What?" he asked himself. "Can she force the guildmasters to return your seat? No. Can she end the war herself? No," he thought. But then sorrow hit him once more like a gale. "Another bottle!" He stared at the letter, but before the next bottle arrived, Ojo folded the letter and dropped it into the still smoldering fire. Penelope was not a storybook hero to return and vanquish the evildoers. She, like he, was just a complicated person pulled in 100 directions. She survived. He, however, had failed. The next bottle arrived, and Ojo used the magic of self-loathing to crawl inside it and weep. Hours later, the door to the private room opened again, but it wasn't his server with another tray for cooking. It was Chris. "I'm sorry for imposing, but I have something to say, and I hope you'll want to hear it." Ojo took a long sip from his cup. He'd gone past intoxicated into thoroughly drunk. "I don't want to hear it," he slurred. "Will it give me back my honor? My status or my arm?" "I forgive you. I forgive Kulo. We were both tricked by Michiko. They orchestrated the attack. Deshike has the evidence. They must have seen an opportunity to sow dissent, to make a move while appearing righteous. They made a smokescreen and profited from it. I want to end the war. Come back. We can make it happen." Chris took a long, burdened breath. Ojo saw the hurt and regret in the youth's eyes. "They said, I'm sorry about what I said, the things I did. But we can fix this." Ojo's ears were working perfectly well. Chris spoke in the same trade language they'd used to speak to each other since the day Chris arrived on Toifé. But Ojo did not hear Chris. The words were lost in a labyrinth of sorrow and self-loathing and inebriation. The fallen warders simply looked down at their cup and drank. When he looked up sometime later, Chris was gone. A half hour after that, Chris's words finally made their way through the labyrinth. The seed of meaning took root and understanding bloomed. In the distance, past the whirling storm that had swallowed his life, he saw the barest glint of hope. And he would not find it here, wallowing. A moment later, the server arrived with another plate of meat. "Thank you," Ojo said. "Water, please, and bread." Chapter 8. Deshike. The communion pool flashed, but Deshike was still reading. He pulled out one of the earlier documents and cross-referenced the dates and the names. The guildmasters might not change their minds, but he would ensure that they had all the information correct. They might divert some energy to propaganda campaigns against Michiko. In that way, at least, Kulo and Rumika would be collaborating, not fighting.
assuming that the elders didn't override Chris the way the guilds had Ojo. The flash came again. Adechike took a long breath, arranged the documents so that he could walk through them easily, and then he grabbed his sword. "Greetings, Guildmasters," he said as the image resolved. This time, Guildmaster Isabri was absent, which probably meant that something important was happening with the fleet. He had more reason to get the truth out, to plead for peace. Guildmaster Nenge said, "Greetings, Warder. I trust you are prepared to receive orders." A veiled threat that meant, "Are you ready to follow orders?" "Yes, Guildmasters, but first I must apologize because there is information you will want to hear and it may impact those orders. So I would request that we discuss it first." Guildmaster Nenge crossed her arms, narrowed her eyes. "What is it?" He told them. The short version, but he repeated Zan's account word for word, as well as citing the supporting evidence, the comments from the other warders. He needed them to see that this was more than one friend vouching for another, even though their nations were at war, which was, on its face, a very strange thing. Not something Adechike thought he would ever have to worry about. "And you received this information from the Rumican?" Nenge asked. "The sailor Zan relayed this account from within a circle of banished lies." Nenge shook her head. "None of this solves Kulo's airstone problem, young warder, so why should it change our course of action?" Instead of throwing the truth in their faces or pleading with them, Adechike told them what they wanted to hear, framed everything in terms of advantage. "It gives us a new way to attack Murtika, one that does not require that we commit more soldiers, but instead lets our scribes and spies strike at our enemy. The more this information gets out, the more pressure we can exert. The more likely it is that Sukusen will speak out against the Empire, the more that revolutionary forces in Murtican colonies will be able to recruit dissatisfied subjects. This report can turn public sentiment against Murtika, and if we can force them to withdraw and fight their internal squabbles, we will be able to do what we must to save Kulo." Guildmaster Amawezi nodded. "Well said, Warder. Send everything to us, and my people will put it to work." Amawezi was the master of the Scribes Guild, which in Kulo included spies and propagandists. War was Kulo's business now, with every one of its industries turned to the nation's survival. "Now, here are your orders," Guildmaster Amawezi said. He was to cut off all private contact with Chris and anyone from Rumika. He could only speak to them in circle meetings or in front of the guildmasters. He was to clear all voting intentions with the guildmasters. "Of course," he said to the order, "but I do know that doing so may undermine the perception of my usefulness as a warder to the other nations, so I will endeavor to conceal this policy with other matters to ensure that we are not perceived to be weak. If I am seen as a pawn, I will not be able to be as much use to Kulo." "Wisely spoken," Amawetsi said. "But the order remains. We trust your cunning." Guildmaster Adokwe added, "And we will be sending new staff to support you, so that you may have a fresh start and clean break from your predecessor. This will, of course, include a new junior warder to support you." Adechike's mind filled with the unspoken addendum, "and to replace you, if need be." He would wear the blindfold they handed him, he would walk the tightrope, and he would make it to the other side, because if he failed, the puppet they'd send to replace him would only make things worse. But first, he needed to speak to Ojo. Chapter 9. Ojo. Flatbreads were a gift from the gods. Several jugs of water and a large meal later, Ojo had his wits back. The pain medication still pushed at the edges, slowing his mind, but slow and precise was worse than slow and sloppy. And it was far easier to stay sharp with company, especially Shun. Today they wore their hair down, braided, with wire-wrapped gemstones woven throughout, playing off their purple eyeshadow and dyed goatee. Between them, a pot steeped for their next cups of tea. A half-dozen plates of sweets and finger food were spread across the table. Ojo could barely think about eating more, but Shun's presence was like a safety net. So many of his best memories of Tuafe were memories of speaking over meals shared and mugs of tea poured for friends here at the Autumn Leaf. "Things were already very bad, but when the leadership won't listen to its warders, Kulo is sinking, 6 of the 7 major nations are at war, and the guildmasters are using abominations to steal entire islands. What can I do? A broken man with one good arm, cut off from his people. There is a great deal you can do, Ojo, especially now. Even while you served Kulo, you've done well to be a force for balance. You've respected the traditions of Tuafe and its people. If you go home, they'll take you off the board entirely. You were a warder to one nation, but if you want, now you can fight on behalf of all peoples, even those without a nation. Ojo stopped and looked at Shun. To many, they were a background figure, even as bold and changing as they presented themselves with clothes, makeup, jewelry, and their body language. Even Ojo, at times, had thought of Shun as a functionary, almost an analog to Yokno. The person that facilitates, a helper in other people's agendas. The same way he'd treated the people of Tuafe when he'd first arrived. The same way the Mertikans treated everyone not their status superior. The point of the circle was to work as equals, even when opposed, to build together, make a common space. The circle should make room to imagine more, to see the nuance, to create possibility. Steam rose from the pot, the tea ready to be poured. Let's say I wanted to do this, Ojo said. What would it look like? I have no power. My resources are Kulo's resources. Shun poured the first round of tea, an old Zanatan tradition. This pot's worth would be taken outside and poured out on the street, another old Zanatan tradition honoring the past and serving as a reminder that the best things took time and repetition. Functionally, it meant that they avoided the bitter taste of the strong black tea, but the tradition was touching. You have connections up and down the islands. Do you think that the guildmasters at the High Skies will let Adechike keep your staff? That they won't be cut off with the same blade that traced the sigil of your dismissal? Anyone cast out can find a home here. I've been doing what I can to keep things stable on Tuafe, especially since the start of the war, and I am far from alone. I have friends here and beyond, and we are in agreement that this war must end before it consumes us all. If you would join us, then gather your staff. Bring them here in 1s and 2s. We'll get them integrated into our network. I'll get you set up with housing wherever you like, though I cannot recommend the ambassadorial level. Of course, if I continue to move in those circles, the High Skies will hear of it. And I do not want to interfere with Adechike. He has enough weight on his shoulders. Of course. And you'll be able to help him and Chris. And the others, Shun said. So, what do we do first? Ojo asked. First, we drink this cup of tea, and we talk about whatever else you want to talk about. Then, when you're healed body and soul, we will get to work. Chapter 10. Chris. Chris sat in the private chambers of the warder's circle, head in hands. Before them, the Rumikan's ceremonial sword lay on the table, alone. The other 6 spaces and seats were empty, leaving Chris as alone as they'd ever been. Without real allies, real leverage, or anything resembling hope. They'd laid out the evidence, and hours later there were no responses to their request to reconvene and discuss. It seemed that even the ream of evidence Michiko had gathered was not enough when each nation had its own reasons to dismiss it. They could demand sanctions, but what good would sanctioning their ostensible ally do if Kulo brushed off the evidence? The only way things would change was if Adechike were able to convince the High Skies faction to turn on Mertika while leaving Rumika be. Footsteps approached, and Chris sat up, wiping away the tears of despair. Adechike. Chris stood to greet their friend and now peer. What did the guildmasters say? The lack of warmth in his eyes told Chris what they needed to know. They won't call off their ships. Adechike approached and stood by his seat on the circle. I'm sorry, but they did tell me this. If Rumika shares the method of airstone refinement, perhaps they would call off the ships, return home to use this knowledge to save our people. The method is the only card we have to play. If I give it to you, especially if the information passes through Tuafe, we have nothing left.
Kulo's forces could take more islands and use the method, turn Rumika's islands into a battlefield, our rich land stained and sullied by the blood spilled between Kulo and the Empire. If Kulo were to withdraw, join my effort to censure Murtika, seek reparations for the trade fleet, then we could work up an armistice. I do not know these High Skies guildmasters well, not nearly as well as Ojo knows guildmaster Shikoshi, but I know that they will not pull the ships back for anything less than the method. So nothing changes? Chris asked. No, if this evidence changes the winds against Murtika, we can beat them back, take the method if you're not able to give it, and then we'll have what we need from Rumika. My people are looking for a way to survive, not to conquer. Is there anything I can do to help you convince the guildmasters? Chris asked. It was a reach, but worth asking. If they were to be friends, even as their countries were enemies, then it could not hurt. Get the others to believe, especially Vanya. And, of course, if you could get concessions from Rumika, even an official admission of guilt, that could change the conversation. I can't convince them if they won't come to meetings. With Suka-sen's seat absent, we need Kasia and at least one of the Imperial warders to do anything. My duty is here. I will not go without a fight. Takeshi stood tall in the doorway, hand on his sword, hair back and up, not down, and must. As he walked, the slump began to return, but he still looked more the warder than he had when Chris had arrived. Without the circle, this war could make Mistfiend chum of all of us. I came here to serve Ikaro. I will not abandon that duty. Nor I, Kasia added, filling the doorway. The war goes on, but we can do good here. Takeshi and Kasia took their spots, and the 4 assembled warders sat. 4 seats, 4 blades. They had a quorum, even if 3 seats lay empty. It would be enough. I suppose that's everyone, Chris said. Hardly, Bologna said, striding into the room. Murtika helped found this circle, and Murtika's voice will not be absent while business is being done. Chris wanted to throw her obstructionism back in her face, to lash out, to challenge, to have her censored from speaking until Murtika addressed the charges they'd laid out. But it was easier to trap an opponent once they'd committed to their strike. Instead, Chris put on a diplomatic smile, trying to remember lessons learned from Alex, but also Ojo, who had shown Chris that politeness and propriety could be weapons as impressive as swords or bladecraft. Thank you for joining us, Warder Avitus. Warders, shall we begin? Chapter 11. Michiko. The trade ship, the Emerald Knife, cut through the sky, chasing the setting sun. Carrying a light load and guided by a skilled bladecrafter navigator, the ship was making excellent time. They were on track to arrive in Kakute late the following night. Michiko stood at the stern, wind whipping her unbraided hair around like the sails. She was no longer a warder, no longer a servant, and no longer did she need to wear her hair as a good Murtican should. Her great-aunt had worn her hair loose or in simple braids in the style of their ancestors. The Emerald Knife was a Kakute merchant sloop. Captain Yamada no Ishii was an old friend of the Silver Sparrow's captain and a fellow supporter of the late Golden Lord. The killing of the Golden Lord was a defeat for the rebellion, but it had also turned him into a martyr. And when Michiko revealed herself as his heir, she would rally the people, give them a new figure to invest in, a way to see the traditions of Kakute upheld. She would become a symbol again, but this time she would be a symbol of resistance, a symbol of tradition, and a symbol of individuality, rather than a symbol of compliance, of servitude, of cultural annihilation. The Empire had made her a puppet, a yes-woman. Lavinia had bullied and battered her for months. Michiko had smiled and nodded along to Bologna's subtle derision and outright harassment. She'd taken it and turned inward time after time. But all of that was done now. She'd served alongside them, learned how they played the game of diplomacy, the sigils they kept back for the most pivotal of duels. And now she would turn all of that against them. Michiko had set off on her journey to Tuafe alone, but arrived with a new friend. She'd left that friend in Tuafe as she returned, but she hoped not to arrive alone. If she was able to do what she'd planned, she'd be the opposite of alone.
crammed into safe houses, sleeping in barns alongside fellow revolutionaries, moving under the cover of night and taking meetings by candlelight with farmers and washerwomen in hushed tones. A revolution was, by necessity, a collaboration. But instead of niceties and negotiations, her tools here would be secrecy, logistics, propaganda. Perhaps it was not so different, after all. She drew her sword, watched the fading lights play across the polished blade in reds and pinks and oranges, like steel of flame. The Golden Lord's escape had lit a spark in Kakute, and now Michiko returned home to become the flame that would ignite the revolution. Kakute would be free once more, she thought, even if I have to cut Murtika from the sky.
You're listening to Born to the Blade, Episode 11, by Michael R. Underwood, starring X.C. Sands, produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Born to the Blade is created by Michael R. Underwood and written by Michael R. Underwood, Marie Brennan, Cassandra Kaw, and Malka Older. It is executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.